It was still early when the sun began to rise over the small town. The streets were quiet except for the low hum of cars heading toward the military base nearby. At the corner of Main Street stood a small diner that had been there for decades. The paint on the sign had faded, but the smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast always brought people in. The morning rush had started early that day. A group of truckers sat in one corner laughing over old jokes. A few locals filled the counter seats, sipping their usual orders. The waitress behind the counter moved quickly between tables, calling out, "Be right with you," every few minutes. She looked tired, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and the irritation on her face showed she'd had one of those mornings. The bell over the door rang softly, and everyone turned their heads for a brief second before going back to their food. A woman had walked in, her uniform dusty and worn. Her left arm sleeve was pinned neatly at the shoulder. The rest of the arm was gone. A faint scar ran across her cheek, and her short hair looked like she'd cut it herself. She carried a small backpack and walked with a limp, each step careful and quiet. She stopped at the entrance for a moment, glancing around the diner. She didn't look for pity or attention. She just wanted a warm meal. Slowly, she made her way to an empty booth near the window and sat down. Her eyes drifted to the menu, though she barely read it. She looked exhausted, the kind of tired that went beyond lack of sleep. The waitress noticed her and frowned slightly. She didn't say anything right away. There was a moment of hesitation, like she was debating whether to take her order now or later. Then she called out to another table instead, asking, "Y'all ready to order?" Ignoring the woman who had just walked in. Minutes passed. The Marine waited patiently, her hands folded on the table. When the waitress finally came over, her tone was flat. "You want something to drink?" she asked, pen tapping against her order pad. The Marine smiled politely. "Just coffee, please, and maybe some eggs and toast if that's okay." The waitress sighed, looking at her watch. "It'll take a while. We're busy this morning." "That's all right," the Marine replied softly. "I can wait." She said it with such calmness that it seemed to irritate the waitress even more. She scribbled the order and walked away, shaking her head slightly as if she couldn't believe someone would sit there in that uniform like it was supposed to mean something. At another table near the back, 3 men in plain clothes had been watching the exchange quietly. Their posture was straight, their eyes sharp. They didn't say anything, but they exchanged small glances. The way they moved, the way they scanned the room, anyone who had served could recognize it instantly. They were Navy SEALs, though no one else in the diner seemed to know. The Marine sat there, sipping water from a small glass the waitress had placed in front of her. The glass was half full and the ice had melted. She didn't complain. She just stared out the window, watching a flag across the street flutter in the wind. Every few seconds, her hand would touch the sleeve where her arm used to be, as if by habit. The waitress returned, setting down the cup of coffee a little too hard. Some of it splashed over the edge.
"Here," she said shortly. "Thank you," the Marine replied, her voice still soft and kind. The waitress didn't respond.
She turned away quickly and moved to the table of truckers, laughing with them as she took their orders. The men in the corner kept their eyes on the scene. One of them leaned slightly forward and said under his breath, "You seeing this?" The oldest of the 3 nodded but said nothing. He just watched, jaw tight. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Plates clattered. Orders came and went, but the Marine's meal never arrived. She didn't call anyone over, didn't complain, didn't even look upset. She just sat quietly, occasionally taking a sip of her now cold coffee. Finally, when the rush started to slow down, the waitress returned to her table. "You still want those eggs?" she asked. The Marine smiled again. "If it's not too much trouble." The waitress rolled her eyes. "Fine. I'll see if the kitchen's still got time." From the next booth, an older couple looked uncomfortable. The woman whispered something to her husband, but he just shook his head and muttered, "Don't get involved." The Marine heard it but pretended not to. She had probably heard worse before, in different places under louder skies. When the food finally came, the plate was cold. The toast was burned and the eggs were rubbery. The waitress slid it across the table without looking her in the eye. "Here you go," she said. "That'll be $10.75. The Marine looked at the food for a moment, then reached for her wallet. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out a few bills. She counted carefully, making sure she had the right amount. Then she smiled up at the waitress. "Thank you for serving me. I appreciate it." The waitress gave a half shrug and turned away without a word. From the back, one of the SEALs muttered something under his breath. The leader shot him a look that said, "Not yet." The Marine took a small bite, though the food tasted like cardboard. It didn't matter. It wasn't about the food. Maybe she just wanted to feel normal again, to sit in a diner like everyone else and not be noticed for what she'd lost. A family sitting near the window had two young boys who kept glancing her way. One whispered to his mother, "Mom, what happened to her arm?" The mother leaned down and said softly, "She's a soldier, sweetheart. She got hurt helping people." The little boy's eyes widened. He turned toward the Marine and gave a tiny salute. The Marine saw it and smiled, a real one this time. She raised her remaining hand and saluted back. The boy giggled, proud of himself, but not everyone noticed that small, beautiful moment. The waitress, now leaning on the counter scrolling through her phone, sighed loudly. "People these days," she muttered, "always want some kind of attention." The words weren't shouted, but they carried just far enough. The SEALs heard them. The Marine did too. She looked down at her plate and didn't respond. The men in the corner exchanged glances again. The tension at their table was thick now. One of them whispered, "That's enough." But the leader shook his head once more. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Let's see how she handles it." The Marine took one last sip of her coffee, set the cup down carefully, and placed the few remaining bills under it. She stood up slowly, her limp more noticeable now. Her eyes stayed low, her face calm. As she started to leave, the waitress called after her, "You done already? Guess the food wasn't good enough, huh?" The Marine stopped, turned slightly, and smiled faintly. "It was fine," she said gently. "Thank you for letting me sit." And with that, she walked out of the diner. The bell over the door rang again, a soft sound that somehow filled the silence she left behind. The SEALs watched her go. For a few seconds, no one at their table moved. The leader finally set down his fork, leaned back, and looked toward the counter. The laughter had faded. Even the truckers had gone quiet. Something about the air felt heavier now. One of the younger SEALs muttered, "She didn't deserve that." The leader nodded slowly, eyes still fixed on the door. "No," he said, voice calm but firm. "She didn't." And that was when he stood up. The other two followed, pushing their chairs back. Every head in the diner turned toward them, sensing something was about to happen. But the leader didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm, steady steps toward the counter said enough. The waitress glanced up, confused. "Can I help you?" she asked. He didn't answer yet, just looked her straight in the eyes. The same quiet strength that filled the room when the Marine entered now stood right in front of her. The waitress shifted uncomfortably. "What?" she said, half defensive, half nervous. He just said, "You already did enough." The other two men exchanged looks but stayed silent. The leader placed $100 bill on the counter, his eyes never leaving hers. Then he said softly, "For her meal, and for the respect you forgot to give." No one spoke after that. The sound of the bell rang again as they walked out, following the Marine's path. Inside, the diner was silent except for the faint hum of the coffee machine. Everyone could feel it. Something had shifted. The laughter was gone. The smell of coffee was still there, but it somehow didn't feel as warm anymore. And somewhere down the street, the wounded Marine walked on, unaware of what the next few minutes would bring, because the story wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. Outside the diner, the air was cool and still. The wounded Marine walked slowly down the street, the morning light brushing across her face. Each step looked heavy, not just from her limp, but from the weight of everything she had carried for years. Pain, memories, silence. She didn't look back at the diner. Maybe she didn't want to. Maybe she'd seen enough disrespect to last a lifetime. Down the road, a few people were setting up shop for the day. The florist, the barber, the newspaper stand. They nodded politely when they saw her, though most didn't know who she was. To them, she was just another veteran passing through town. But to those who served, one look at her uniform said enough. The patches, the faded colors, the wear and tear, they told a story words couldn't. Back inside the diner, the three SEALs still stood near the counter. The waitress avoided their eyes, pretending to wipe the counter though it was already clean. The silence was thick, stretching longer with every passing second. Finally, the leader of the group spoke quietly. "Do you even know who that woman was?" The waitress shrugged, still not meeting his eyes. Some soldier, I guess. They come in all the time. I don't have time to babysit everyone who wants attention. Her words made one of the younger SEALs step forward, but the leader lifted a hand, stopping him. His voice stayed calm, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. She wasn't asking for attention. She was asking for respect. You treated her like she didn't matter. But that woman, she's a Marine, and she's seen more pain than you could imagine. The waitress finally looked up, her face caught between embarrassment and defiance. Look, I didn't mean anything. We're busy, okay? People come in here all the time with stories. You can't treat everyone special. You don't have to treat everyone special, the leader said softly. Just treat them human. He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the door. The others followed. Before leaving, he glanced toward the manager who had just come out from the back. The manager looked around the room, realizing something was wrong but not yet knowing what had happened. The SEALs stepped out into the sunlight, squinting slightly. The street was quiet again. A few blocks ahead, they saw the Marine sitting on a bench outside a small park, her backpack beside her, a cup of coffee from a vending machine in her hand. She looked peaceful but distant, like someone who had learned to live between worlds, one of noise and one of silence. The leader walked toward her slowly, not wanting to startle her. When he got close, he said gently, "Ma'am, excuse me." She turned her head, a little surprised. For a moment, she didn't recognize them. Then she noticed their posture, their eyes, the unmistakable look of soldiers who'd been through the same kind of hell. She gave a small nod. "You were at the diner?" "Yes," he said. "We saw what happened." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's fine. It's not the first time someone's looked at me like that. Probably won't be the last." He shook his head. "It's not fine." For a moment, they sat in silence. The sound of birds filled the space between their words. The younger SEALs stood a few feet back, giving them privacy. The Marine took a sip of her coffee and said quietly, "You can't change how people see you. Some folks only see the scars, not the story behind them." She looked down at her missing arm and gave a small shrug. "It doesn't bother me anymore." "Not really." The leader looked at her, studying the calm on her face. "You were a medic, weren't you?" Her eyes lifted slightly in surprise. "How'd you know?" He smiled faintly. "The way you moved. You checked the exits when you walked in, counted the people without realizing it. You were trained to stay aware, to protect others before yourself." She let out a soft laugh. "Yeah, old habits." Then her voice softened. "We were in Helmand Province. There was an explosion. I was pulling one of our guys out when—" She glanced at her shoulder and didn't finish the sentence. "I got lucky, though. I made it home." The leader nodded slowly. "Lucky isn't the word I'd use." She smiled again, this time a little more real. "Maybe not, but I'm still breathing. That's something." For a few moments, they just sat there in the quiet. Then the Marine stood up, adjusting the strap of her backpack. "Thanks for checking on me," she said kindly. "But really, you don't need to worry. I'm used to it." Before she could walk away, the leader said, "You shouldn't have to get used to disrespect. Not after what you've done for this country." She paused, her eyes softening a little. "You learn to pick your battles," she said gently. "Some are worth fighting. Some aren't." Then she looked toward the diner. "This one maybe wasn't mine to fight." He followed her gaze. "Maybe it's ours then." She looked at him curiously, unsure what he meant. But the way he said it, calm, certain, made her believe something was about to happen. The SEALs watched her walk away, heading down the road toward the bus stop. She moved slowly, but with the quiet pride of someone who refused to let pain define her. When she disappeared around the corner, the leader turned back toward the diner. "Let's go," he said simply. Inside, the same customers still sat in their booths, but the air had changed. The laughter was gone. The waitress was refilling sugar jars, trying to pretend nothing had happened. The manager stood near the register, frowning at the tension in the room. When the three men walked back in, everyone looked up. The leader went straight to the counter. The waitress froze when she saw him again. "Look," she started. "If this is about earlier—" "It is," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You embarrassed someone who's given everything for this country." She didn't want praise. She just wanted a meal. The manager stepped forward, confused. "What's going on here?" The leader turned toward him. "Your employee disrespected a Marine, a decorated combat medic who lost her arm saving others. She sat in that booth for almost half an hour while everyone else got served. She didn't complain once. The manager's eyes widened. He looked toward the waitress. Is that true? The waitress's face turned pale. I didn't know who she was. That's the point, the leader said quietly. You don't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. The diner was silent again. Even the truckers in the corner had stopped eating, their eyes fixed on the scene. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Finally, the manager nodded slowly, shame flickering in his eyes. You're right, he said softly. You're absolutely right. He turned to the waitress. You can clock out. We'll talk later. She looked like she wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She grabbed her things and slipped out the door without a word. The leader reached into his pocket, took out a folded note and some cash, and placed it on the counter. This is for her meal, he said. And this, he tapped the note, is for you to hang somewhere people can see it. The manager unfolded the note. The handwriting was strong and simple. Respect isn't earned by medals. It's owed to sacrifice. The manager stared at it for a long moment, then nodded. I'll hang it right there, he said quietly, pointing to the wall near the register. The seals didn't stay for thanks. They turned and left as quietly as they had come. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, lighting up the flag across the street. For a moment, the leader looked at it, then at the road where the Marine had walked earlier. One of the younger seals broke the silence. You think she'll ever know what we did? The leader smiled faintly. Maybe, maybe not. But it's not about that. It's about making sure no one forgets her kind of courage. They stood there for a while, watching cars pass by, each lost in thought. Then they headed down the road toward the base, the sound of their boots steady and sure. Back inside the diner, the manager taped the note to the wall, right next to the register. A few customers read it as they paid their bills. One old veteran nodded quietly, a tear forming in his eye. By lunchtime, people in town were already talking about what had happened, how 3 quiet men had stood up for a Marine no one really knew. The story spread quickly, though no one knew their names, and by the end of the day, a small sign appeared in the diner window. It said, "All veterans welcome. Coffee's on the house." The waitress never came back to work, but something good had started because of her mistake. Something small but real. A reminder that sometimes, even an ordinary morning can teach an entire town the meaning of respect. And somewhere, miles away, the Marine sat on a bus heading home, unaware that her quiet grace had changed everything. She looked out the window, the town fading behind her, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled. Not because the world had suddenly become kind, but because somewhere deep inside, she still believed it could be. The small town had always been quiet, the kind of place where people noticed every little thing that happened. But that day, something different hung in the air. Word about the diner had started to spread, not through gossip, but through whispers of pride, guilt, and respect. It began with a single post on social media. Someone who had been in the diner that morning wrote a short message. Saw something powerful today. A Marine treated poorly by someone who didn't know her story. 3 men stood up for her, reminded us what real respect looks like. Within hours, that post was shared hundreds of times. People in town started talking, asking who the woman was, who the men were. No one seemed to know, but everyone wanted to. At the diner, the manager had kept his word. The handwritten note, "Respect isn't earned by medals, it's owed to sacrifice," was taped to the wall behind the counter, framed neatly in clear glass. It became the first thing customers saw when they walked in. The next morning, the diner was quieter than usual. People came in, read the note, and looked around as if expecting to see the Marine walk through the door again. The waitress who had disrespected her didn't return, but her absence didn't bring anyone satisfaction. If anything, people just felt sorry. Sorry it had taken something like that for everyone to remember what manners really meant. Meanwhile, at the base outside town, the 3 seals went about their day. They didn't talk much about what had happened. It wasn't the kind of thing they needed credit for. But deep down, it had stayed with them, especially the leader. He kept thinking about the Marine's calm face, the way she smiled even when treated badly, and the way she said, "You learn to pick your battles." That line echoed in his head. Maybe she was right, he thought. Some battles aren't fought with weapons or rank. They're fought with dignity. Later that afternoon, he found himself walking toward the small park near the diner, the same one where she had sat after leaving. There was a breeze moving through the trees, and the bench where she'd been sitting was empty. A cup of coffee sat on the ground beside it, the kind you buy from a vending machine. It was half full, now cold. He stood there for a moment, staring at it. It wasn't just a cup. It was a small piece of her story left behind. He picked it up and threw it away, then sat down on the bench. Across the street, he could see the diner's sign flickering in the sun. People were going in and out, and for the first time, he noticed something different. When an older veteran walked in, everyone greeted him warmly. The same waitress who used to work there wasn't around, but another young girl smiled and said, "Welcome back, sir." That small act made him smile. Maybe change didn't always come in big waves. Sometimes it started with one quiet person who chose to stay kind even when others weren't. The next few days moved quietly. The Marine hadn't come back to town, but her story kept spreading. Local papers wrote about the diner lesson. The story was short, just a few paragraphs, but it touched everyone who read it. It even reached a small veterans center nearby. One morning, an older man in a wheelchair rolled into the diner. He had a patch on his jacket that said Vietnam Vet. He looked around, saw the note on the wall, and smiled. "About time someone put that up," he said softly. The manager brought him a coffee on the house. "You must have heard the story?" The old man nodded. Heard it, felt it too. Folks forget sometimes that freedom has a price when it's not just paid overseas. It's paid every day by the people trying to live with what they gave. That line hit everyone who overheard, and from that day more veterans started coming in. The diner, once just another stop on Main Street, became a quiet meeting place for people who'd served. They didn't make speeches or demand thanks. They just sat, shared stories, and drank coffee together. One afternoon, about a week later, a news van pulled up outside. The reporter came in asking if anyone could tell the story of the mystery Marine. The manager gave a small smile and said, "We don't know her name, but we know her heart." The reporter asked to film the note on the wall, and when the story aired that night, thousands more saw it. Messages began pouring in from veterans across the country, some saying they'd faced the same kind of treatment, others saying it gave them hope to see that people still cared. At the base, the SEALs saw the story too. The younger ones smiled, nudging each other. "That's her," one said. "She's the reason everyone's talking." The leader didn't say much, but he felt a sense of pride. Not because their names were tied to it, they weren't, but because something good had come from something small. A quiet woman's grace had started a wave of kindness without her even knowing. The next morning, as he drove past the park again, he saw something that made him stop. On the bench where she once sat, someone had left a folded letter under a small rock. He got out of the car and picked it up. It was simple, just lined notebook paper folded neatly. The handwriting was careful, shaky in places, probably from someone older. The note read, "To the Marine who sat here, thank you for reminding this town what real courage looks like. We didn't see your name, but we saw your heart. You changed more than you'll ever know." He stood there for a while, reading it over and over. Then he folded it again and placed it back where it was under the rock. Some things didn't need to be taken. They just needed to stay where they belonged. That evening at the diner, the manager decided to add something new to the menu. At the very top, written in simple letters, were the words, "The Hero's Breakfast," dedicated to every man and woman who served. It wasn't fancy, just eggs, toast, and coffee. But every time someone ordered it, $1 went to a local veterans support fund. Within days, people started ordering it by name, and then, one quiet afternoon when the lunch crowd had slowed down, the bell over the diner door rang again. The manager looked up, and for a moment he couldn't believe it. It was her, the wounded Marine. She walked in slowly, her same calm presence filling the room. The customers who had heard the story looked up from their meals, recognizing her from the description that had spread all over town. But no one stared rudely. Instead, they just nodded. A silent thank you. She made her way to the same booth by the window. The new waitress hurried over, smiling warmly. "Welcome back. Can I get you some coffee?" The Marine smiled gently. "Yes, please." When the coffee arrived, the waitress placed it carefully on the table. "And breakfast?" she asked. The Marine looked at the menu and noticed the new item, the Hero's Breakfast. For the first time in a long while, she laughed softly. "I'll have that," she said. While she waited for her food, the manager came over, nervous but genuine. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. What happened that morning should never have happened here." She looked up at him, kindness in her eyes. "You don't owe me anything. People make mistakes. What matters is that they learn from them." He nodded, his voice tight with emotion. "We did. You taught this whole town something we forgot." She smiled and looked toward the wall where the framed note still hung. Reading it, she tilted her head slightly. "That's a good message," she said softly. The manager smiled. "Someone left it for you." For a long moment she just stared at it, her eyes glassy but calm. Then she said quietly, "Tell them thank you, whoever they were." After finishing her meal, she stood up to leave. The customers around her didn't clap or make a scene. They just nodded respectfully as she passed. A quiet wave of gratitude. Outside, she stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking back at the diner one last time. Through the window, she could see people smiling, talking, and treating each other with warmth. The world wasn't perfect, but for that moment, it was better than before. She took a deep breath, the sun warm on her face, and started walking again, one step at a time, steady and strong. Behind her, the bell on the diner door rang again as another veteran walked in, greeted with the same kindness she had inspired, and without saying a word, the town kept living by the lesson she had quietly taught, that respect doesn't need grand gestures, just simple decency. The Marine never asked for recognition, but somehow, she gave everyone something far greater, a reason to be kind again. The next few days passed quietly in town, but the story of the wounded Marine didn't fade. In fact, it began to travel further than anyone expected. The small diner that once stood half empty in the mornings now stayed busy from sunrise to sunset. Veterans came from nearby towns just to see the note on the wall, the one that said, "Respect isn't earned by medals, it's owed to sacrifice." Some brought their families. Some came alone. Many didn't say much at all. They just sat down, ordered a coffee, and looked at that note like it reminded them of something they'd lost, or maybe something they were still holding on to. The manager noticed how people had started treating one another differently. There was less impatience, fewer sharp words, more quiet kindness. Even small things, like someone holding the door open or paying for another person's meal, seemed to happen more often now. It was as if the Marine's calm, unspoken strength had rippled through everyone she'd crossed paths with. But not everyone had moved on easily. The waitress who had disrespected her that morning hadn't returned to work. She'd packed up her things and left town for a while, too embarrassed to face anyone. The guilt had settled in slowly, heavier each day. She kept seeing the woman's face in her mind, the soft smile, the gentle way she said, "That's all right. I can wait." It wasn't anger that haunted her. It was grace, the kind of forgiveness that makes you see yourself more clearly than you want to. One evening, as she sat in a small motel room a few towns away, she saw the story on the local news. They showed the diner, the note on the wall, and the line of people standing outside just to eat there. When she heard the words, "The waitress has not been identified," she felt her throat tighten. She turned off the TV and sat in silence for a long time. Then she whispered to herself, "It's time to go back." The next morning she drove back to town. It was early, the sky still pale with dawn. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. She didn't know what she would say, or if anyone would even listen, but she knew she had to try. When she pulled up in front of the diner, she almost didn't recognize it. The windows were clean, the sign had been repainted, and a small flag now hung near the door. Through the glass, she could see customers already seated, chatting softly. She hesitated before stepping inside. The bell over the door rang, and for a moment the room went quiet. People turned to look, recognizing her face from that day. The manager froze behind the counter, coffee pot in hand. She swallowed hard and said quietly, "I came to apologize." The manager set the pot down and nodded slowly. "You don't owe me that, but maybe you owe it to her." The waitress's eyes softened. "I know. That's why I'm here." She looked around at the people watching. "I can't take back what I did. I was tired, careless, and I treated someone like she didn't matter. But she did. She still does. I've thought about that moment every day since." Her voice trembled slightly. I didn't realize she'd changed all of you, too. The manager looked at her for a long time, then said quietly, "Sit down. Let's talk after the rush." She nodded and found a seat in the corner near the window, the same booth where the Marine had once sat. The sunlight poured in softly, and she stared at the empty table for a long time, as if expecting to see the woman appear again, calm and quiet, coffee in hand. As the day went on, a few people came over to speak to her. None of them were cruel. One man simply said, "It takes courage to come back." Another added, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after." Those words eased something inside her. When the crowd thinned, the manager sat across from her. "You know," he said slowly, "she came back once." The waitress looked up sharply.
"She did," he nodded.
Sat right there in that same seat. Ordered the hero's breakfast. She was calm, just like before. Said people make mistakes and that what matters is they learn from them. Tears filled the waitress's eyes. "She forgave me," she whispered. "She did," the manager said softly. "But she didn't know you'd left. Maybe it's time you forgive yourself too." The waitress wiped her eyes, trying to steady her voice. "Do you think she'll ever come back again?" The manager shrugged gently. "Maybe. People like her, they don't need recognition. They just move on quietly, leaving the world better than they found it." For a long time, they both sat in silence, just listening to the faint hum of the diner and the sound of coffee cups clinking. Later that evening, when the last few customers left, the waitress asked if she could help clean up. The manager nodded. As she wiped the tables, she looked again at the note on the wall. The handwriting was firm, steady, and full of meaning. She whispered to herself, "Respect isn't earned by medals, and it's owed to sacrifice." That night, when she left the diner, she didn't feel as heavy as before. She wasn't proud of what she'd done, but she was thankful for the chance to change. Meanwhile, miles away, the Marine had returned to the small town where she grew up. It wasn't far, a quiet place surrounded by hills and open land. Her days were slow, peaceful. She spent her mornings walking near the fields, her afternoons volunteering at a community center for veterans. One day, while sorting through donated boxes, she came across an old newspaper clipping. It was the same story about the diner, only now it had been reprinted in a national magazine. The headline read, "A Lesson in Respect, How One Small Town Remembered Its Heroes." She read it slowly, smiling to herself. They'd written about her without naming her, describing her as a wounded Marine whose quiet strength restored decency in a world that sometimes forgets. She set the article down, her eyes misty but calm. It wasn't fame she felt, it was peace. Knowing that a small act of patience had reminded people of something bigger than anger or pride. A few days later, she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was messy, uncertain. Inside was a short note that read, "I don't expect you to remember me, but I'll never forget you. I was the one who served you that morning at the diner. I was rude, impatient, and wrong. You didn't yell or scold me. You just stayed kind. That kindness changed me. I wanted you to know I'm trying to be better now, for you and for everyone I meet." The Marine held the letter for a long time. Then she folded it gently and placed it in a small box filled with keepsakes. A few medals, a photo of her old unit, and letters from people whose lives she'd touched without even knowing. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she sat outside her porch, listening to the crickets and the wind. She thought about the waitress, the diner, and the 3 quiet men who had stood up for her that day. None of them had done it for attention. Each of them had acted from something simple: respect, empathy, and a shared understanding of what it means to carry unseen wounds. The Marine smiled to herself and whispered, "Maybe that's all the world really needs, people who care when no one's watching." Back in town, the diner continued to grow. A small display was set up near the entrance with photos of veterans from the community. People brought in old pictures of parents, siblings, and friends who had served. Underneath each photo, the same line was written, "Respect owed, not earned." The waitress, now working part-time again, greeted every customer with warmth. When veterans walked in, she offered coffee before they could even ask. Sometimes they'd talk about service. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence, sharing that unspoken understanding. The note on the wall never came down. It stayed right where it was. A reminder of one woman's quiet strength and one town's second chance to remember what mattered. As winter approached, the town held a small ceremony outside the diner. Veterans, families, and townspeople gathered to dedicate a new flagpole in honor of all who served. The manager spoke briefly, his voice full of emotion. "This isn't just about one person," he said. "It's about all of us learning to see one another with kindness again." When the flag rose against the cold sky, the crowd stood silent. The wind carried the sound of the fabric as it waved, strong and steady, just like the people it honored. And somewhere, a few miles away, the Marine stood on her porch, watching the same wind move through the trees. She didn't need to be there in person to feel it. She already knew. Her story had found its home. Weeks passed quietly. The air had grown colder and winter had started to settle over the small town. The diner still opened every morning before sunrise, with soft lights glowing through the frosted windows. People came in wearing coats and scarves, shaking the cold off their shoulders before sitting down at the counter for coffee. The same warm smell of pancakes, bacon, and fresh coffee filled the air, a smell that now carried a story behind it. The waitress worked quietly but kindly now. Every time she poured someone's cup, she made sure to smile. Some customers knew her story, some didn't, but everyone could feel the difference in her. She listened more. She cared more. The sharpness that once lived in her tone was gone. It was replaced by something gentler, a quiet respect that didn't need to be spoken aloud. On one of those cold mornings, the door opened and a rush of icy wind came through. The bell above the door jingled softly. When people looked up, they saw her, the wounded Marine. She had come back. The diner fell silent for a moment. She stood in the doorway wearing a long coat and a knitted scarf. Her steps were slow, careful but steady. A faint smile rested on her face as she looked around the place she hadn't been in since that morning. The waitress froze behind the counter. For a second, she didn't know what to do. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she walked over. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice soft but full of feeling. The Marine looked up, and that same calm expression she had worn before returned. Kind, gentle, forgiving. "I wasn't sure you'd ever come back," the waitress said. "I've been waiting to say I'm sorry. Not just for what I said, but for what I didn't see that day. You deserved better." The Marine smiled. "You already said it. I got your letter." The waitress blinked, her eyes widening slightly. "You did?" "I did," the Marine said softly. "And you don't owe me anything. We all have days when the world feels heavy. I just hope yours feels lighter now." The waitress nodded, tears filling her eyes. "It does, because of you." The Marine placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then that's enough." They stood there for a moment in quiet understanding, and no anger, no shame, only forgiveness. The other customers watched, some pretending not to stare, others smiling softly. It wasn't dramatic. It was just real. The waitress guided her to a seat, the same one she had sat in before near the window where the sunlight now spilled across the table. The Marine ordered the same thing she had last time, coffee and the hero's breakfast. While waiting, she looked around and noticed the framed note on the wall. It had been placed in a small wooden frame, surrounded by photos of veterans and handwritten thank you notes from families. She smiled as she read it again. Respect isn't earned by medals. It's owed to sacrifice. When her meal came, the waitress placed the plate down gently and said, "This one's on the house." The Marine chuckled lightly. "You don't have to do that." "I know," the waitress said, "but I want to." As she ate, the door opened again. The familiar sound of boots against the floor made her glance up. The three SEALs from before walked in, their laughter soft but steady. They'd just returned from another mission, faces a little older, a little more worn, but still carrying that same steady strength. When they saw her, they stopped in surprise. Then smiles broke across their faces. "Well, look who it is," one of them said with a grin. "Didn't expect to see you here again." She smiled warmly. "Guess I couldn't stay away." They came over, shaking her hand, clapping her gently on the shoulder. It wasn't loud or showy, just quiet respect. The kind that doesn't need words. They all sat together, and for a while the diner buzzed softly with laughter, stories, and the sound of clinking cups. Other customers watched the scene unfold, the Marine, the SEALs, the waitress, all sitting together at one table. There was something healing about it, something beautiful in its simplicity. After a while, the Marine leaned back and said softly, "Funny how life works. One bad morning turns into something that changes a whole town." The SEAL beside her nodded. "That's because you handled it the way most people wouldn't have. You didn't fight back with anger. You showed grace." "That's rare," the Marine smiled thoughtfully. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than shouting." The waitress listened from behind the counter, feeling her heart swell. She couldn't believe she was hearing this. The same woman she had once ignored now sitting just a few feet away, surrounded by respect and quiet admiration. When they finished eating, the SEALs paid for everyone's meal again, just like before. But this time, instead of leaving a note, they left something else, a small medal placed under the coffee cup. When the waitress found it, she turned it over in her hand. On the back, engraved in small letters, were the words, "For courage shown in silence." That night, after the diner closed, the waitress placed the medal next to the framed note on the wall. The light above it flickered gently, catching the shine of the medal. She whispered, "Thank you," and turned off the lights. The Marine didn't come back to town often after that. She had her own life to return to, the community center, the veterans' meetings, the quiet rhythm of her days. But sometimes she'd receive postcards from the diner, photos of families, small flags outside, new people visiting from other towns. Each card signed with a simple message, "Still remembering." One spring morning, the Marine stood outside her house watching the sunrise. The air smelled fresh and the fields shimmered with dew. She thought about the people she'd met, the waitress, the manager, the SEALs, and the lessons they'd all learned together. She realized something important that day. It wasn't about revenge or pride or proving a point. It was about how people change when they are shown a better way, how kindness can move through others like a quiet echo, long after the moment has passed. At the same time, back in town, the diner had become something more than a place to eat. It had become a symbol. Local schools brought students there to learn about respect and service. Veterans met there every Sunday morning, drinking coffee and sharing stories that no one else could quite understand. On one wall, beside the photos, hung a new sign, painted in bold letters, "Hero's Corner," where every meal is served with gratitude. One afternoon, as the waitress was wiping down tables, a young boy came in with his grandfather, an old man wearing a faded cap. The boy pointed to the wall of photos and asked, "Grandpa, were you one of them?" The old man smiled softly. "No, son. But I knew one, a Marine. Strongest person I ever met." The waitress overheard and smiled quietly to herself. She didn't need to ask who he was talking about. Everyone in town knew. The Marine's story had become a part of their lives, a reminder of what respect, forgiveness, and simple kindness could do. Years later, even when new people took over the diner, the note and the medal stayed on the wall. Some of the faces changed, but the spirit didn't. Every person who walked in felt it, the warmth, the quiet honor that hung in the air. And though time moved on, the story never faded. People still spoke of the day a wounded Marine walked in and changed everything. Not through anger, but through grace. Sometimes, when the wind blew softly through town, carrying the faint sound of laughter and the clatter of dishes, it almost felt like she was still there, sitting by the window, sipping her coffee, reminding everyone that kindness, no matter how small, can leave a mark that never disappears. Because sometimes the greatest strength isn't in fighting back, it's in staying kind, even when the world forgets to be. And that simple truth, learned in a small diner, on an ordinary morning, became the lesson that town carried forever.